Hey guys, welcome to video number 3 for chapter 35. For this video and for the next one, we're going to be talking about the rise of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism refers to, these types of governments and leaders that emerged in the 1920s and 30s, particularly in Europe, who had, as we say, totalitarian control. By the 1930s and, as the Great Depression was in full swing worldwide, a lot of people were starting to reject the liberal movements for democracy and freedom, and they were starting to turn towards more extreme alternatives. These alternatives took the form of what we call totalitarian rule. The word itself is easy enough to remember when you look at the first part of it. Total. Totalitarian rulers have total control. They can do whatever they want, such as Kim Jong-un in North Korea today. It didn't manifest itself in just one form, though. We'll talk a little bit later in the next video about fascism, but for this one, we're going to be talking about communism in Russia. But before we get to that, first we just got to finish up, I guess in some ways like the last phase of the Russian Revolution and talk about the Russian Civil War. So in the previous chapter, we talked about Lenin and the Bolsheviks and how they took power, and won over the people with their slogan of peace, land, and bread. They didn't win over everybody, though. A lot of Russians still supported the old order, which led to civil war. This war was fought between the communists, the Reds, and the forces loyal to the Tsar, the Whites. All right, so just kind of an artistic rendition of the two. Red obviously being the symbol of communism, so that's easy enough to remember. Now, Lenin's main focus during this was crushing all opposition, and this led to a campaign known as the Red Terror. Suspected anti-communists were arrested and executed. The secret police, kind of like a predecessor to the KGB, they killed as many as 200,000 enemies of the Bolsheviks. We really think of like the use of terror come around with Stalin, but it was around when Lenin was in charge as well. The most noteworthy example was when the Tsar and his family, this was the most noteworthy example of the use of terror. The Tsar and his family, remember, they were removed from power, but they were still alive and kicking under house arrest in 1918. The Reds decided that they were too dangerous to live. So Nicholas, his wife, and all 5 of his children, they were executed in the basement of the house in which they were being held prisoner. Now, the peasants mostly supported the Bolsheviks. They were not particularly big fans of the Tsar. They also didn't like them because the whites, if they won, that would mean a return into the fighting of World War I. And the whites had support from foreign countries, leading to Russian national support for the Reds. So after a bloody war that claimed close to 10 million lives between the fighting, disease, and starvation, the Reds emerged victorious, and in doing so, they transformed the economy through what was known as war communism. Now, war communism eliminated private ownership of banks, industry, farms, businesses, pretty much everything. The government took control of everything in the country. Now, this wasn't particularly popular, as you can imagine, especially at first, but really, nor was it productive. It'd be one thing if it was unpopular, but it was working. It wasn't really working. Agricultural production in particular was way down. So with production down and unhappiness up, Lenin decided to reverse things somewhat in 1921 with the new economic policy. This really showed Lenin's pragmatism. This made accommodations by allowing private ownership of farms and small businesses, but the big stuff like banks, industries, and transportation systems remained under government control. The NEP was fairly successful in reinvigorating the economy, but Lenin didn't live long enough to see it. He died in 1924, and a bitter and bloody struggle for power ensued. This struggle would eventually be won by Joseph Stalin. All right, so for this slide, we're going to be talking about the Soviet Union under Stalin, and that's really kind of, as it emerges onto the world scene and also in the Cold War. We'll talk a little bit more of that in a different chapter. All right, so let's talk about Stalin. He was not a particularly noteworthy or important figure in the revolution or the Civil War, but he was very good at positioning himself in the new government. He used cunning to build alliances, and he was a very ruthless individual. He used ruthlessness in going after his enemies in order to triumph over his rivals in the Communist Party. Eventually, Lenin's favored successor, Leon Trotsky, was forced to flee the Soviet Union because he knew that he was on the outs, and execution was what was waiting for him, with Stalin taking control. And by 1928, Stalin had solidified total control over the country. He decided to replace Lenin's NEP with his own 5-year plans. Now, as you can imagine, they were plans for 5 years. And the main goal of these plans was to transform the USSR from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial one. Stalin felt that they were too far behind the Western countries, such as Great Britain and the United States, when it came to big-time industry. The plan set target quotas, hence the 5 years. They set them for production of things like steel and machinery. And as the Great Depression hit, the Soviet Union's economy became almost completely centralized. Now, while Soviet production of consumer goods declined because Stalin didn't really care about things like refrigerators or automobiles and so forth. He wanted the big stuff. So that stuff did decline. The 5-year plans did see success in big industry. The same success wasn't seen, though, in agriculture, and that was because of collectivization. Let me just move this down now because we got some pictures coming. So the Soviet government ended all private farm ownership and forced farmers onto large collectives. And they said, all of these people, maybe they owned smaller plots of land before, and they said, none of that anymore. You're going to give up your individual ownership, and everyone's going to come to work on these big cooperative farms where all resources and crops were then pooled. Now, collectivization was resisted by some, particularly this group known as the kulaks. They were wealthy peasants who hated the idea of losing their status. And Stalin was brutal and ruthless in making sure they got on board. He would have some executed, obviously, but many of them he just had driven from their land. He took it from them and said, "You're off." Peasant resistance was common, not just among the kulaks, but even among some of the lower level peasants. They'd purposely kill their livestock, burn their crops, and many peasants, such as the ones up here that you see being forced, but also a number of them by choice, they left the countryside to go look for work in the cities in these new factories that were emerging. Overall farming production decreased significantly, and this led to widespread food shortages and later on to famine. So the disaster of collectivization started to lead some to doubt Stalin's leadership ability, which led him to put his Great Purge into effect. Stalin decided to purge or cleanse all disloyal elements from the Communist Party. He mostly targeted old Bolsheviks, including 2/3 of the Central Committee, which was a high-ranking organization in the Communist Party, and over half of the army's high-ranking officers. He saw them as a threat to his leadership, his vision of the future, and his desire to rewrite the history books to give himself a more prominent place in the revolution and civil war. It wasn't just members of the government, though. Any citizen who spoke out or was critical of Stalin was targeted. Now, most of the people targeted were executed, and many of them in mass graves, as you see this. But a lot of them were sent to gulags. Gulags were labor camps in Siberia, and these were essentially death sentences. You died of starvation, of freezing, disease, things of that nature. By 1939, 8 million Soviet citizens were in these labor camps, and another 3 million had been killed. Whoops. Hit that by accident. Sorry, guys. Okay. So that wraps things up for totalitarian rule in the Soviet Union under communist control. We will come back and talk about the communist Soviet Union in another chapter. But for the next video, we will start getting into fascism.